They say trust is the currency of a marriage, but I learned mine was being traded behind my back. 26 years together, and the woman I built my world with had built a secret one of her own. I found it one night, not in a love letter or a text, but in a line of numbers on a folded piece of paper. A hidden bank account, my money, her lies. That's when I stopped being the fool she thought I was, and started becoming the man she should have feared all along. They say every marriage has its secrets. I just didn't know mine came with a 6-figure price tag. For 30 years I woke up at 5:30 sharp, made my coffee black, kissed my wife, Clara, on the forehead, and drove to work. Same route, same job, same routine. I believed in structure. It made the chaos of the world feel smaller. But what I didn't know was that the chaos had already moved into my house and slept beside me every night. It started with the receipts. Nothing big, just small things that didn't match up. A hotel bill in a town she never mentioned visiting. A transaction from a jewelry store I'd never heard of. I thought it was a mistake. Maybe fraud. Maybe something harmless. Clara smiled when I asked. That soft, practiced smile she used when she wanted to calm me down. "Oh, that? It's from a client dinner," she said. Except Clara didn't have clients. She was retired. Still, I wanted to believe her. God knows I wanted to. When you've spent your whole life building something with someone, the last thing you want is to admit it's all made of glass. But the cracks kept showing. One night, I walked past her office and saw her computer screen still on. I shouldn't have looked, but I did. Her email was open. The subject line read, "Wire transfer confirmation." It was addressed to herself. I clicked it, and my stomach went cold. A bank account. Not ours, not joint. An offshore account in her name. The balance? $287,430. Every breath felt heavier. My mind ran through every late-night phone call, every girl's weekend, every missing dollar from our joint savings. She had been saving, no, hoarding, behind my back. For years. I stared at that number until my eyes burned. My wife had more money hidden away than I could make in 3 years of work, and I didn't even know it existed. That night she came to bed late. She smelled of expensive perfume, not the kind she used to wear. She slid under the covers and turned her back to me, and that's when I realized I wasn't sleeping next to my wife anymore. I was sleeping next to a stranger, but I didn't confront her. Not yet. I wanted proof. I wanted to see how far she'd go, so I started watching. Every transaction, every phone call, every time she smiled when she thought I wasn't looking. And what I found made me wish I'd never opened that email. You don't really hear betrayal when it happens. It doesn't shout. It whispers. It seeps in between moments of silence and turns familiar sounds into strangers. For weeks, I played dumb, smiled, ate dinner, talked about the weather. But every word from her lips felt rehearsed. Every gesture, an act. She had no idea that I was already tracking her. I installed a camera in her office, the same one where she'd been writing her memoir. Funny thing, though, memoirs don't usually involve encrypted transfers to private accounts. Every night, after she went to bed, I'd watch the footage on mute. There she was, laughing softly into her phone, whispering names I'd never heard. Sometimes she'd pull out a small metal lockbox and count cash. Sometimes she'd type furiously, her face tight, focused, almost hungry. I started piecing it together. She wasn't just hiding money. She was building a life without me. One night I found the missing puzzle piece. A message from a man named David. He wasn't a banker. He wasn't a friend. He was hers. Once the money clears, we can disappear, the message read. He'll never know. You deserve better. My blood went cold. All those years, the love, the laughter, the promises, they meant nothing. She'd been planning her exit like a thief casing her own home. The next morning, I made her breakfast. Eggs, toast, black coffee, just the way she liked it. And when she smiled and kissed my cheek, I smiled back. Because now I knew exactly what I had to do. For 2 weeks, I played the perfect husband. I fixed the faucet, trimmed the hedges, took her to dinner, even danced in the kitchen to that old song she loved. She thought she had me fooled, but the truth? I was quietly gathering everything. Copies of her emails, screenshots of every transfer, photos of the lockbox, evidence, enough to bury her in the very lies she built. I also visited my lawyer, an old friend who owed me more than one favor. I told him everything. He didn't say much, just nodded, took notes, and finally looked me in the eye. You've got one chance, Jack. When she slips, you catch her. And when you do, make sure it's airtight. And so I waited for her to make her final move. 3 nights later, she did. Clara told me she was heading out to meet a friend from yoga. But I watched her get into a black car, David's car. I followed them, headlights off, keeping my distance. They drove to a small cabin on the outskirts of town. From the trees, I watched them laugh, drink, kiss. And as the lights went out, I felt something inside me go dark too. Not rage, not sadness, just a cold, hollow silence. That's when I made my plan. I wasn't just going to confront her. I was going to make her see what betrayal feels like. To strip her down to the truth. The one she'd buried beneath every lie, every smile, every stolen dollar. She thought she'd taken everything from me. But she forgot one thing. I know how to survive. And this time I wasn't going to lose. There's a cruel clarity that comes when you stop pretending you're surprised. After the cabin, after the photos and the receipts and the names my wife smiled into being, the work stopped being personal in the way it had been that first night I found the account. It turned into something colder, architecture. I began to treat this like the job I knew best, measure twice, cut once. I laid plans the way I used to lay joists, precisely with an eye to load and balance. There would be no shouting, no smashing plates in the street. I wanted proof that could not be bent by tears or charm. I wanted witnesses, ledgers, and a timing so clean it would leave her no place to hide. The first step was to secure my life. Money is what broke the bedrock she slept on. It's where I had to start rebuilding. I met with Mark again, the accountant who'd muttered professional the night he saw the spreadsheet. He came to my garage, hands stained from engine grease and coffee, and we spread everything out across an old workbench. He showed me how to stitch dates to deposits, how to trace wire transfers through shell entities that tried to look ordinary. You can make a case with this, he said. You just have to be patient. Patience was a new kind friend in those lonely hours. We opened a safety deposit box in a different town under a trust name, my father's middle name, tucked into the paperwork like a brick with a familiar stamp. In that box I put originals of the bank statements, the photos I'd taken in the rain outside Daniel's yard, a printout of the emails from the laptop. The box became my ark, evidence sealed, dated, and out of reach of someone who'd already proved she could move money like a shadow. I did not tell Clara where any of it was. I stopped sharing passwords. I changed my email recovery questions. I became invisible in the administrative corners of my own house, and it felt like armor. At the same time, I had to turn the social web that had sheltered her into a web that exposed her. People protect what comforts them. They protect reputations they've benefited from. I started small. The way you loosen a screw until the whole thing comes apart. I called a woman who used to host the charity galas where Clara loved to be seen. She answered with the surprised sweetness of someone who knows nothing of ledger lines. I asked her casually about receipts from last year's auction, about an odd check someone had shown me at the hardware store. She went quiet. After a pause, she asked me to come by the next morning to look at the accounting book. When she closed her office door in my face, the lock clicked like a countdown. I learned to let institutions do what gossip can't. Banks hate risk. Accountants hate missing numbers. Charity boards hate scandal. I fed each a tidy pack of information, not accusations, just questions. We've noticed potential duplicate payees, I wrote to a banker under the guise of identity theft concerns. Can you confirm whether X account has had any wire transfers to Y vendor? I kept my queries impersonal and dry because that's the language that makes the ordinarily comfortable feel a prickle. They pulled up data. They asked for more. I responded with scanned copies. Slowly, then all at once, the gears moved. But evidence alone is not theater. Evidence is a scalpel. Theater is a mob. I needed both. I needed the ledger to be undeniable and the community to be ready to see it. So I arranged for two things to happen nearly simultaneously: the bank investigation and a quiet conversation at the community center. I invited 5 people I knew would respond to facts rather than feelings. The charity treasurer, a longtime vendor who'd been paid with cash, a lawyer friend, a retired mechanic who owed me favors, and the reporter I trusted. I asked them to come to the town hall under the pretense of a discussion about fiscal responsibility. They came because that's the sort of civic thing good people do. They didn't come expecting a revelation. That was the point. Before the meeting, I sat on the bench outside and called my daughter. Her voice, still tight and guarded, brought a knot to my throat. I want you there, I said. No speeches. Just listen. She agreed, not because she trusted me more than her mother, but because she wanted a place to hear the truth herself, rather than through fragments. That night I tasted a fear that had nothing to do with law or money. It was the fear of breaking open the life of someone you love and watching how the people you've shared Sunday dinners with rearrange themselves on the other side. At the meeting I didn't perform. I laid out the binder, opened it to the first page, and left my notes folded in plain sight. I let the treasurer sift through canceled checks, let the vendor confirm prepayments he'd never tied to work done, let the reporter take photographs with a careful lens. There was a peculiar sound when people realize they've been part of a machine that ran on false fuel. They exhale together, embarrassed and angry. Eyes that used to blink in greeting now narrowed. The social fabric that had been woven for Clara began to show frayed edges. While the community prepared to look, I took steps to throttle the cash flow. I asked my lawyer to file a protective notice with the bank and with the mortgage holder. It's unglamorous, the way paperwork can be a wire across a map. But when you file the right form, it can freeze a life. When the bank placed a temporary hold on accounts, the comfort she'd relied on became discomfort. Vendors stopped accepting envelopes without invoices. The charity put her events on hold pending an audit. It was a quiet strangulation, but a strangulation nonetheless. Clara noticed, of course. Her facade didn't crack immediately. She's clever in that way that puts rehearsed pain into public view. At first she blamed clerical errors and misunderstandings. When I met her in the grocery aisle and asked how she was, she smiled with those warm eyes of hers and said, "This will blow over." I pretended to be surprised, to be worried for her, and in the meantime, I watched how her hands shook when she thought no one could see. That tremor told me more than any courtroom would. The hardest part of this period wasn't the strategy. It was watching the collateral damage. People I'd trusted as neighbors, men I'd lent tools to, women who'd watched my daughter grow up, felt betrayed when they learned they'd been complicit, even unknowingly. Some reached out to say sorry. Others refused to look me in the eye. The town is a small organism. When one part gets infected, the rest of it rushes to immune. I felt both relief and a sad kind of guilt. Justice has costs. Sometimes you pay them in the currency of relationships. As the bank audit deepened, Clara's desperation grew more visible. She tried charm, then gifts, then threats. She sat with me one evening and pleaded, voice trembling, "Frank, please. If you ruin me, you ruin this family." She put her hand on mine in a way that felt practiced rather than pleading. I let her feel the weight of my indifference. I told her instead that I wanted the truth and that if she would only come clean, I would deal in facts, not fury. She laughed, a brittle, alarmed sound, and walked out. When she stepped up the pace, I made sure the timing amplified the details. The first time she tried to withdraw a large amount from the hidden account, the bank flagged the transfer because I had a notice in with compliance. They contacted my lawyer. When the transfer failed, she panicked and made mistakes. A hurried call to Daniel with a line I recorded where she said, "Freeze everything. He's poking around." That tape was the kind of evidence that makes a judge lean forward. There's a peculiar pleasure in listening to your own life's thief panic into a phone. Her voice loses the smooth polish and becomes ragged human. It was not joy that made me play that recording to my lawyer. It was the efficiency of truth. All the while I had to keep my face placid in public. There's an art to being betrayed and looking ordinary. People expect drama, men scowling in bars, women chanting on porches. What unsettles them is a measured man who does his work quietly. I showed up to town meetings. I mowed the lawn next door for an old widow. I fixed a neighbor's fence without charge. Those small acts were my resume for the argument I'd make in the court of daily living. That I was, after all, the same man I'd always been. Steady, honest, and reliable. When a neighbor asked how my day was, I'd say, same old, and tuck the binder deeper into my bag. The night before our scheduled hearing with the mortgage company, a step I'd set up to ensure the house didn't transfer before claims could be addressed. Clara walked into the kitchen and looked at me the way she used to when we first married, with that mix of mischief and affection that could still make a man feel young.
"You've been different lately," she said, leaning on the counter.
Quieter. I set down my mug and met her eyes. "You changed too," I said. "You took quiet and you thought it would keep you safe." She bit her lip and said nothing. For a moment there was simply the hum of the refrigerator and the steady beat of my heart. Then she turned and left. The hearing went exactly as the dry paper promised. The mortgage company put a hold. The bank froze assets pending the audit. Vendors were asked for reconciliation. It wasn't dramatic. There were no shouts in the hallway. There was the monotonous click of a clerk stamping forms, and that stamped noise felt to me like the closing of a trap. When Clara realized what had happened, she tried the only language she had left, her performative sorrow. She called my daughter, crying and telling a story designed to make her the victim. My daughter listened. Then she called me. When she came to the garage where I worked, she didn't look like the daughter I'd raised through scraped knees and school plays. She looked older, wary in a way I recognized as awakening. She sat down and I pushed a folder across the bench. Inside were photos of an envelope being slipped into Daniel's glove box, time-stamped and annotated, copies of the emails, and a printout of the account statements with my notes scrawled in the margin. She read in silence. When she finished, she reached out and took my hand, and it felt like the town had been returned, not by any paper, but by the small human thing of a child believing her father again. That night, Clara packed a bag. She tried to leave quietly, thinking perhaps anonymity and distance would blunt the impact of exposure. I watched her gather the things she thought to take: jewelry, a stack of cash she'd kept in the jar behind the sugar. She paused at the doorway and looked back at the house one last time, as if scanning what she could not steal with her hand. She met my eyes for a fraction of a second, and in that look was the exact measure of what she'd been. Not cruel in a single stroke, not monstrous, simply willing to remake her life on someone else's labor. She left before dawn. Her car's taillights disappeared into the mist. For a few hours it felt like a victory that needed celebration. But victory of that kind is numb. The house was quieter, yes, but I'd been awakened to a truth I could not undo. People you build your life for can become strangers, and a man can fix a porch and still be hollowed out in the parts that don't make a sound. Yet the work wasn't done. There were still legal hearings, restitution calculations, and the inevitable chorus of friends who would try to put the pieces back together in the way that suited them. I had exposed the account. I had cut off the flow of money. I had coaxed witnesses and coaxed institutions into action. But there was one final element I wanted in place: a public accounting that could not be shrugged off as private marital strife. I wanted the truth to sit in the open where people would have to choose what to believe in front of their neighbors. So I prepared for the hearing that would follow, where facts would be read into the record, and the ledger of her life would be balanced in the daylight. When the day of that hearing came, I'd laid the groundwork to make sure the judge would hear the tape with Daniel on the line, see the deposit chains, and glance over the invoices she'd forged. It would be a methodical thing, not a spectacle. But a methodical truth is cleaner and harder to ignore than any scream. I slid into the bench in the courtroom and felt the weight of the binder at my side like a promise. Clara sat across, pale and small, the person who once used my name with tenderness now reduced to a cluster of paper and shadow. The clerk called the case, and I watched the room look at the paper, then at me, then at her, and something that had been misaligned began to correct itself in tiny, stubborn motions. There are moments where a man feels the arc of his life correct. The tide turns not with great lightning, but by inches, each inch a sacrament. That day the inches stacked. People read the documents, the judge made notes, and the ledger spoke loud enough that whispers lost their teeth. Clara's world, built on small thefts and soft lies, began to unspool. When the hearing adjourned, I walked out into a bright, brittle afternoon. The air felt cold and honest. I had done what I set out to do. I had exposed the secret account, stopped the flow, and made sure the town would see the facts plainly. But as I drove home, the binder sitting quiet on the passenger seat, I understood the last truth I had to live with. The map was clear, but the road back was long. I had taken the first usable steps. The rest would be the slow, honest work of rebuilding what I'd let her take for granted. When the judge read his notes into the record, the sound didn't feel triumphant. It sounded like a ledger closing, like a hammer tapping down on something long overdue. He spoke quietly, almost wearily, the way men do when they've seen too many cases that all look the same under fluorescent light. Betrayal, greed, someone left cleaning the mess. Still, when he said the words transfer of funds to be returned to the joint estate, I felt a small vibration in my chest. It wasn't joy. It was a kind of weary equilibrium. After all the planning, after the sleepless months, after the humiliation of pretending not to know, I'd reached the simple fact that the law recognized what had been done. Clara didn't look at me. She sat with her lawyer, her hair tied in that same careful knot she used to wear to charity dinners, and stared straight ahead. The hearing was quick. The documentation was airtight. The hidden account was emptied by the court into an escrow pending division. The house would stay in my name until restitution was complete. Her new life, the one she'd built in whispers and wire transfers, had been amputated cleanly. When it ended, she stood. For a moment I thought she might speak. She didn't. She gathered her purse, the same red one she used to flaunt at church, and walked out without looking back. I watched her silhouette fade through the glass door and thought of all the mornings we'd shared coffee by the window, planning weekends, complaining about bills. Funny how easily routine becomes fiction once the truth steps in. Outside, reporters waited, not many but enough to make her flinch. They'd caught wind of the charity audit, the frozen accounts, the respectable woman now under financial scrutiny. She tried to cover her face. The cameras still clicked, and in those flashes I saw her final performance fail. The woman who had spent years controlling narratives had lost her audience. I didn't speak to them. I walked straight past, binder in hand, and headed toward my truck. The world didn't feel lighter. It felt realer. The kind of real that hurts your lungs because the air is no longer filtered through lies. The next weeks were quiet. The house was mine again, but it echoed differently. The walls no longer hummed with her footsteps or her music. At first I hated the silence. Then slowly I realized it was the sound of ownership. I started fixing the small things she'd ignored. A leaky tap, the creaking floorboard in the hallway, the broken latch on the shed door. Manual work steadies a man. You mend things outside while the inside learns how to breathe again. Neighbors began to stop by. Some offered sympathy, others curiosity. The treasurer from the charity brought me a pie, left it on the porch, and said, "People know now. You did what had to be done." I thanked her, but the words didn't land. I hadn't wanted applause. I'd wanted truth, and truth, when it finally stands naked in daylight, isn't applause-worthy. It's humbling. One evening, I sat on the porch with a beer, watching the sun dip behind the trees. My daughter pulled up in her car, same look of quiet resolve she'd worn the day she'd read the folder. She sat beside me without speaking for a while. Finally she said, "Mom called. She says she's sorry." I nodded. "Is she?" I asked. She sighed. "I think she's scared." We sat in silence for a while. Then she added, "I told her I needed space. But I also told her that you didn't ruin her." She did that herself. That broke something in me. Not sadness, not relief. Just the recognition that the cycle had turned. My daughter could see clearly now. That was the real victory. Later that night I went into the study and opened the binder one last time. I flipped through every page, the photos, the statements, the transcripts. Each piece of paper represented a cut I'd endured, and each signature I'd gathered was a stitch closing the wound. When I reached the end, I closed it gently and slid it into the bottom drawer. That chapter, for all its wreckage, was finished. A week later, I got a letter from the bank. Restitution completed, accounts balanced. My lawyer called it a clean exit. I called it the quiet after a storm. The house felt heavier, but it was mine again, not just legally, but in spirit. I planted new grass where her rose garden had been. I rebuilt the fence she'd said was too old to bother with. Every board, every nail, every bead of sweat was a sentence in a new story that no one could forge. Months passed. Rumors about Clara faded. The town moved on. It always does. I heard she'd moved 2 counties over, trying to start fresh. Maybe she found another man to charm, maybe she didn't. I didn't care. My life no longer hinged on her choices, but sometimes, when the evening light falls just right on the kitchen wall, I see shadows of the life that was. The good dinners, the laughter, the feeling of being seen. And I think to myself, I didn't lose those memories. I survived them. She once told me that money was power. She was wrong. Money disappears. Truth doesn't. And the truth, my truth, is this. She stole years, but I took back every one of them. Not with violence, not with hate, but with patience, precision, and the simple, stubborn will to outlast deceit. So if anyone ever tells you revenge is sweet, don't believe them. Revenge isn't sweet. It's clean, and sometimes clean is enough.